Well, I talked yesterday about the pressure around Sergio Perez as he took the pole for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, and there was a lot of pressure in the race. Again, you could look at it from one side of the fence, I guess, and say, well, he had a great car and he won the race easily, no problem for him. You look at it another way, which is that he's Sergio Perez. He's not Max Verstappen, and he's got Max Verstappen remorselessly coming through the field behind him, and he knows exactly what Max is doing at any stage of the race. And he's got Fernando Alonso to beat as well. And he's got a safety car that comes in and interrupts his flow, his rhythm. Just when he's pulled out a nice gap over Fernando, the safety car comes in and nullifies that. But not to get ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the start of the race. Sergio Perez on the pole, on the clean side of the grid, makes a very good start. But on the acceleration run down to turn one, it was Fernando Alonso's Mercedes-powered Aston Martin that got the run down the inside. And when Fernando's got a nose there, you've got to let him go. And Perez did exactly the right thing there. Fernando, absolutely gorgeous the way he went through turn one on the limit. And so he was leading the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix from Sergio Perez. At that moment, of course, anything could have happened. But it was interesting to see how Perez paced his race. For the first 4 or 5 laps, he just sat there. He knew immediately that he had that advantage through sectors 2 and 3, but he used it actually through sector 1. He used it by using the tyres hard in sector 1 and then relaxing the car through sectors 2 and 3, knowing that he could pick it up with speed through the air. And that's exactly what he did. Once DRS came into play, straight past Fernando under braking for turn 1. And in that sector, that first sector, he then immediately pulled out 3/10 over Fernando. So you can look at all the graphics on screen during qualifying and the build up to the race, and indeed during the race, and you can see that the Aston Martin's got a lot of grip in the slow corners. But of course, in the race, Sergio did it absolutely perfectly because he cruised sectors 2 and 3, just kept the gap stable with Fernando, and then really caned it in sector 1, where it was relatively simple to pull out a gap. And he's got, of course, that wonderful feel in terms of acceleration out of slow corners as well. And we saw that in the way he managed his rear tyres today. Really, really good on that side as well. Of course, there was a lot of tension in the back half of the race after the safety car. Once Max Verstappen had got up to P2, which he did beautifully. I mean, it was just a phenomenal drive from P15 up to P2. Once he got there, he was 5 or 6 seconds behind Sergio Perez. And the big question then, of course, was Brazil 2022. And what would be going through the mind of Sergio Perez? Indeed, what would be going through the mind of the Red Bull management on the pit wall? If I'd been on the pit wall, I would have been very nervous today and actually quite annoyed that the two drivers were pushing one another as hard as they were, because they were going quicker than they needed to go. The gap they had over Alonso, once they got it to 10 seconds, they could have just backed off, but they didn't. They just continued to take time out of one another. And every time Max did a really good job on a lap, Sergio responded, and then Sergio backed away to save the tyres, and then Max put in another fastest lap. So it's not what you want when you've got an easy 1-2 and you're way ahead of the third place guy, in this case Fernando Alonso. But the matter resolved itself, kind of, when Max reported that he felt some vibration. He felt that the drive shaft, which he's very sensitive to now, having had a drive shaft failure yesterday, the drive shaft was starting to feel a bit rough again. And obviously at that moment, he had to start preserving the car and thinking about finishing the race. Still fastest lap was out there, but to be taken. That's another story. So at this moment, Sergio Perez is on the radio, just prior to that, is on the radio saying, what's going on? We don't need to be doing this. And the answer was, well, you can race. So it was a tense moment certainly from Perez's point of view. From Max's point of view, it was pretty straightforward. There he was going to go as quickly as he could, and he was going to put pressure on Sergio, and maybe he was going to win this Grand Prix. So from Perez's point of view, it was a stressful 5 or 10 laps, 10 or 12 laps, probably it was, not knowing how quickly to push the car, but wanting to keep the gap at around 4.5 to 5 seconds, preferably 10 seconds if he could. And this comes back, as I say, to Brazil and what happened there when Max didn't give that position back to Sergio Perez as they had agreed over some other incident. They said it was Monaco, but I've got my doubts about that. And it hasn't been resolved by the management, because Max, in the race, it was very clear that given the slightest opportunity, he would have been pushing Perez all the way to the finish. But when that drive shaft issue came into play, he backed off, he did the right thing, And so it was resolved. But this needs to be looked at. I mean, how they're going to do it, I have no idea, because Max Verstappen is not the sort of driver that will ever listen to anything other than go and win the race, Max. That's the way he is. He's a racing driver, pure and simple. And Sergio Perez, I think, up until Brazil last year, was the perfect wingman. I think he still is the perfect wingman, providing he's got no real opportunity to beat Max. But throw him the slightest bone of being able to beat Max Verstappen, like Max having a problem in qualifying, and he's going to be out there for the win. And he drove beautifully today. He drove like a winning Grand Prix driver drives if they're potentially on the way to winning a world championship. He looked really, really good, really polished in everything he did, every pass he did, every piece of time management, everything was great. And that's, Max Verstappen will not be concerned about that at all. But from the outside looking in, you can say that as this season develops, there will continue to be more fireworks at Red Bull. And I don't believe they're going to be able to solve that problem. And they never have. They couldn't solve it in the Weber-Vettel days, and I don't think they will now. So it all ended with Max backing away a little bit, and it was a 5-6 second gap towards the end, and Sergio believing that he had fastest lap, which of course is 1 point these days, and 2 laps to go. He said, who's got fastest lap? And he said, you have, Sergio. And so he didn't back off, but he just drove to the checkered flag, as you would if you've been leading the race from the start, almost from the start, and victory's there. And on that last lap, Max went out and got the fastest lap and got the point. Not a big deal, but it did actually. There is a little bit of who's leading the world championship now. And now it's Max Verstappen and not Sergio Perez by 1 point. But it was interesting that after the race, Sergio didn't know that had happened, and he had to hear it from the media. And as soon as he heard it, he was a bit shocked. And he was under the impression that, I guess, that Max was nursing his car to the finish. So again, a little bit of an insight on what's going on behind the scenes at Red Bull. But got to hand it to them. I mean, what a day, what a drive. First of all, from Sergio Perez to control the race the way he did with the intervention of the safety car, which basically came in at a good moment in terms of the pit stop for tyres for the front runners. But nonetheless, the gap he had over Fernando suddenly disappeared, and all of a sudden it was, let's start racing again. And secondly, that drive by Max Verstappen through the field from P15 on the grid after the drive shaft failure yesterday. He didn't do a time in Q2. And it was really interesting, I think, to watch Max's driving in the early laps when he was in amongst the Hasses and the Alpha Tauris, and there's bits of front wing end plate flying everywhere, and Gasly and Piastri are having a shunt, or touching one another out of the first corner. And it was, I mean, this was Max absolutely perfect again. The patience he showed when he was behind the 2 Hasses, he was just sitting there watching them, waiting for their tyres to go off a little bit on full tanks. Obviously, he had an advantage, but those 2 cars are very quick in a straight line. But when the DRS came into play, he just timed the passes absolutely perfectly. And when he was passing guys like Lewis, who drove pretty well today, different strategy to George Russell, different strategy to everybody else. He started on the hard tyre and then switched to the medium. Everybody else started on the medium, went to the hard, within reason, apart from Charles Leclerc, who started on the soft. When he came up to pass Lewis, there was absolutely no contest. I mean, this was, forget Hamilton, Verstappen from previous years. Lewis was never, ever going to be in this race against Max Verstappen. But when Max did the pass on Lewis, it was so perfunctory and it was so simple that you just thought, wow, this is a Sunday afternoon drive. Of course, it wasn't. And this was Lewis Hamilton that he was out braking. But for Max, it was just, it just made it look so easy, which, of course, as I keep saying and have said many times on these videos, is the epitome of the art. So, yeah, I mean, P15 to P2, an astonishing drive. And yet, when you saw it, it just looked pretty straightforward, really. It didn't look spectacular. It was just watching him going up through the lap chart, watching him do this, watching him do that. Of course, the car was brilliant everywhere, particularly in a straight line. And like Sergio, he was surprisingly quick in Sector 1, which is where the Red Bull's not supposed to be at its 100% best. And afterwards, out of the car, he looked like he'd just been out for a sort of Sunday afternoon stroll, as indeed did Sergio, got to say. Both of them looked really good when they got out of the car. And there were smiles. I don't think Max was very happy after the race, actually. I think he was irritated that he hadn't won that Grand Prix and that he had that drive shaft issue. I think in his mind, he would have just kept going and maybe he could have won that. So we'll have to see what happens. As I say, roll on Melbourne. Fernando Alonso, P3. Bit of a glitch at the start when he pulled up slightly ahead, I think, of his grid line. Got a 5-second penalty, which he served in the stop when they all came in behind the safety car, which is, I suppose, is okay, but I think that probably needs to be looked at because it didn't really penalise him very much. But anyway, that was out of the way. And then, he was exactly as I said in qualifying. He was always going to be good in terms of grip. He was always going to be a sitting duck in terms of top speed, and that's the way it was. And the only way he could fight back was with grip level in effectively in Sector 1. And that meant that he had to use his tyres a little bit harder than Red Bull. And that was the difference. And he did really well, finished P3, and if you look at his lap times towards the end, it was quite interesting because George Russell finished 4th in the Mercedes. And let's look at Fernando when he's trying to get a 5-second gap over George, because there's a bit of confusion as to whether or not he had actually served the full 5 seconds or whether it would count behind the safety car. So George was trying to get within 5 seconds of Fernando. And Fernando's doing, towards the end, he's doing 33.1, 33.0, 32.9, 32.8. But George is doing 32.9, 32.9, 32.9, 32.9. So the Mercedes, in that situation in the race, with George on the absolute limit, Fernando, you could say, well, I think he was flat out as well. Yeah, they weren't actually that much quicker than Mercedes. If they were a shade quicker, probably, but not a lot. And that will give Mercedes a lot of, not confidence. I doubt we can't even use the C word with Mercedes at the moment. But I think there'll be probably a C for confusion, actually, because having sort of race 2, Toto and everybody else ad nauseum saying, they've got to change the philosophy of the car. They've got to do a suddenly new Gerard Ducarouge type 60-day new car. Now there's George actually going just about as quick as Fernando Alonso in race conditions over quite a long period of time. So that'll be slightly odd. And in that situation as well, in top speed, they're both doing about 303 outside the DRS, Mercedes and Aston Martin, that is. So Aston Martin a bit better in the race than they had looked, and Mercedes, you could say, not absolutely brilliant in terms of top speed in the race. They presumably will be thinking about that as well. Lance Stroll was going pretty well, and in terms of passes of the race, we've got to think about maybe giving it to him on lap 1 around the outside of Carlos Sainz at turn 13 on the opening lap, full tanks, tyres not up for temperatures, on the outside of Sainz on that long bank left-hander, and went round him. Pretty impressive. I mean, Carlos Sainz is beginning to look like a driver that most of the other drivers know isn't necessarily going to fight back and do a lot dramatic in response. But nonetheless, a pretty good manoeuvre by Lance Stroll. But he didn't finish. He retired. And of course, it was his retirement that brought out the safety car and inadvertently kind of gave the race a little bit back to Fernando again. So good teamwork. Although at the end, with all the mechanics, the Aston Martin mechanics in green in front of the podium, and Fernando being Mr. Charm, Mr. Charisma with the fluorescent green Aston Martin cap and the smile and the just looking $100 million, you had to think that I'm not sure Stroll Senior will be that happy about the way things are going at the moment. This is Fernando almost becoming bigger than the team. And what's happening with my son? Why is he retired and what's going on? I'm probably exaggerating there, and probably, it will not be that. But I'm just suggesting that is a sign that, this is a team. This is a very different sort of team. This isn't Red Bull where Dietrich Mateschitz loved lots of different racing drivers and loved putting them together, seeing them compete and giving an opportunity to many young drivers. This is the father of one driver, effectively buying a Formula One team for him, and seeing now the Fernando Alonso phenomenon, and he wants his son there. Anyway, we'll see what happens in Melbourne. I mean, Lance did pretty well, got to say, and that pass around Sainz was impressive, got to say, very, very impressive. So George Russell, a very good 4th, Lewis Hamilton 5th. He didn't really go anywhere on that choosing of hard tyre. Not quite sure what that was all about. I guess it was, well, I've got to try something. When I go, I'm pretty good at tyre management. I'll just see how long I can run this opening stint and see if I can pick up positions that way. And it didn't really work out. The grip was not good. As I said, as I said yesterday, the medium tyre was a really good race tyre in Saudi Arabia, the medium Pirelli. And to be on anything other than that at the start of the race was really asking for trouble. And that kind of coloured Charles Leclerc's race as well. He started P10, as we know, and eventually finished P7 behind his teammate. But had he started on the medium, maybe he would have had a better race. Anyway, getting back to Lewis Hamilton, he struggled on the hard. Then he was on the medium. And for a while, he was starting to catch George and putting pressure on George. But then George started to see that he had a possibility of getting P3 if he can get within 5 seconds of Fernando. It wasn't actually the case, but he was driving flat out in the hope that it would be. And got away from Lewis then. And then Lewis's medium started to go off towards the end of the race. So it was okay. It was a good race. I mean, Toto was on the radio to Lewis afterwards saying that was a really good drive, Lewis. Of course, it was a good drive. But it wasn't the sort of drive that Lewis Hamilton will want to be thinking about on his flight back from Saudi Arabia tonight. It'll be, I'm glad that race is out of the way. We've got to make some changes for Melbourne. Still, I'm sure that'll be the mindset, certainly, of Lewis Carl Hamilton. And no surprise, really, because he doesn't want to be passed by Max Verstappen as if he's going backwards. He doesn't want to see, he doesn't want to be racing the Hasses and the Alpha Tauris and all that stuff and the Alpines. He wants to be at the front. Of course, everybody does. But Lewis is entitled to think that way. Let's put it like that. And in the end, he got beaten by George anyway. So that's probably the worst aspect of the weekend, when you get beaten by your teammate. So, not a good one for Lewis. Carlos Sainz did okay. Went round and round and round. Incredibly consistent. And I was making a note of his lap times for wanted something better to do. When the whole Red Bull thing started to quieten down, I was just looking at what Carlos is doing. 33.8, 33.9, 33.4, 33.4, 33.4, 33.4, 33.2, 33.3, 33.5, 33. I mean, unbelievably consistent, which either means he's quite a long way away from his limit and he was just cruising, or it means, wow, this guy's unbelievably consistent. I'm not sure which it is. Probably, I think it was the latter. He's developing into a very, very consistent driver. And on this occasion, he did finish ahead of Charles Leclerc on the road, even though Charles, of course, had that penalty. Let's look at some of the other results. Yeah, the Alpines, as I said, throughout the weekend, looked pretty good. Both of them finished in the top 10. Esteban Ocon passed Pierre Gasly on the outside at the restart, which won't have impressed Pierre. I'm not sure, he's got any explanation for that or he can answer for that. But nonetheless, a really good move by Esteban Ocon. And he finished ahead of Pierre Gasly, 8th and 9th. They were, the Alpines, so they'll be pleased with that. And Kevin Magnussen brought one of the Hasses home in P10. Not a brilliant qualifying for them, but good to see them in the points as well. Yuki Tsunoda, P11. Nico Hülkenberg, P12 in the other Haas. Congratulations to Frederick Vesti on his win in the F2 feature race. And congratulations to Checo Perez. Lots of pressure, and he withstood it all. And he won. Lots of pressure, not only from Fernando Alonso, but from Max Verstappen. And he withstood it all. And he won the Grand Prix. He didn't get his fastest lap, and I think he's a bit irked about that. But nonetheless, a perfect day otherwise. Well, almost perfect. Didn't make it into turn one leading the race, but great pass. And wow, yeah, very, very good win. And Red Bull, chapeau to Red Bull. Amazing performance, amazing first two races. Let's see what happens in Melbourne. I'm actually recording this in Madrid because this is the opening week of the F1 Global Exhibition on which I've been working for the last 2 years. So lots going on here. That's why the background looks a little bit, I think there's a line behind me. It's a bit wonky. That's a blind in front of the window in my hotel room. So excuse me for that. But yeah, busy week here in Madrid with the opening of the exhibition. It's going to be, I hope it's going to be amazing. And for those of you that are going to come to see it in Spain, there's 3 months to do it. It's not that difficult to fly to Madrid from the UK or from wherever. I hope you really enjoy it. And don't worry if you can't, because it will be coming to many other venues in the course of time. It'll be in Madrid for about 3 months. And I think you will enjoy it, actually. Lots of Formula One, endless Formula One, as we know and love it. Anyway, see you soon.